This Boeing 747 is making its final approach at Kyrgyzstan's Manas International Airport. Because of the very dense fog, the plane is operating flawlessly, and the pilots are preparing to do a typical out-of-land maneuver while adhering to the ILS approach. However, are they actually? This is the story of Turkish Airlines Flight 6491. A flight crew of 4 Aksit Airlines pilots was scheduled to perform 2 flights under a wet lease contract on behalf of Turkish Freight on January 15, 2017. After starting in Hong Kong, the first aircraft carrying KOSA and Turkish Cargo 6491 would fly to Manas Airport in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan, where the crew would change, before the last flight would continue on to Ataturk Airport in Istanbul, Turkey. The pilots were well rested when they found themselves on the bus heading out to the airport in the evening of the scheduled flights, since they had taken advantage of a rather lengthy rest time of 69 hours in Hong Kong before to the journey, which they had spent in a hotel in the city. Although 4 pilots were assigned to this assignment, only 2 of them would actually fly the first trip. The other 2 would take over for the second journey to Istanbul after traveling passively for the first leg. The maiden flight was to be piloted by a Turkish citizen, a 59-year-old with little over 10,800 hours of experience. The Boeing 747 was the only aircraft he had been flying. Had flown as pilot in charge for about 820 hours at the time of this mission. Like the 59-year-old first officer he was about to share the cockpit with, he had served in the Turkish Air Force before flying commercial aircraft. With around 5,900 hours of total service, including 1,758 hours spent flying on the 747, the first officer was likewise very experienced. Since they had previously flown together, the pilots knew one another well enough to begin pre-flight preparations as soon as they got to the airport. A 14-year-old Boeing 747-412 freighter with no known technical issues was the airplane they would be flying. Only a few minor dents were noted in the tech log, and all of them fell within acceptable operating parameters. After the captain confirmed it, the pilots focused on the weather, which seemed to be a little more challenging for the first flight. Although the weather was good, a cold front had moved over the Bishkek region, bringing with it freezing frontal fog and very chilly air. It was predicted that throughout the night and around the time of their scheduled arrival, this fog would reduce visibility to 200 meters with vertical vision, as low as 100 feet at their destination. However, it was predicted that things would start to improve about 600 the next day. Even though Manas Airport has a Category 2 approach system. I'll explain what that is shortly. The visibility was so bad that it wasn't really suitable for use as a scheduled destination. Even though the pilots were aware that the approach to their destination would become difficult, the aircraft was nonetheless permitted to be sent out since the 2 alternatives, Astana and Karaganda, were much better and had mostly mist and light snowfall. In any case, it didn't really matter since, as long as we have at least 2 backups running, pilots often have to begin flights in questionable weather. Although we may have to divert in the worst situation, a Category 2 ILS will often bring us down close enough to the runway to allow for a safe landing, even in very severe fog. In order to determine their departure fuel of 96,640 kilograms for their 6-hour journey to Manas, the pilots proceeded to review the note dumps. After finishing, they went outside to the aircraft and began preparing it for departure. Because the weather was predicted to be so marginal upon arrival, the captain chose to pilot the aircraft as required by the Aksit Airlines guidelines. Now, this is rather different from how my airline functions in such conditions. If we suspect that a Category 2 or Category 3 approach will be flown, we always designate the first officer to be pilot flying. This is because we fly these approaches as monitored approaches, which means that the first officer will fly the aircraft down to the minima and through a potential missed approach, but the captain will take over if sufficient visual references are visible at the minima. This is a great method to use the crew, and if a landing is planned, the captain won't have to switch from scanning the instruments to outside references, since he can just be looking outside for the approach light. However, Agseat Airlines conducted it differently for whatever reason. In order to determine if they could land before they reached the minima, the captain would instead be flying the approach and wait for the first officer to inform him if he saw anything outside. If he did, the captain would immediately switch from his instruments and begin gazing outside. In this scenario, this strategy will ultimately have some major repercussions, but we'll discuss that later. There was a little delay in transferring their stuff into the main cargo hold while the pilots were getting the plane ready to take off. As a result, the pilots were nearly 2 hours late when they were eventually able to request push and begin at 1912. As a result, they would now have to work until at least 2:00 a.m., which is getting close to the circadian low window. Everything went perfectly well, including the cab ride out, the takeoff, and the first ascent from Hong Kong. At around 400 feet, the captain activated the autopilot, and they proceeded to ascend to flight number 340's cruising altitude, or about 34,000 feet. After then, the flight continued as usual until around 2 hours before to the landing, at which point the captain turned over the controls to the first officer and began getting ready for the approach and his approach briefing. Unfortunately, the cockpit voice recorder began recording a little after the captain had begun his briefing because this approach briefing and what he chose to include and remove from it will prove to be crucial for what is about to happen. The investigators were nevertheless able to infer from its content, however, that he probably did not go over the various distances versus altitude checks shown on the ILS approach map. If the aircraft was keeping the proper altitude, the most crucial of them would have been the last approach point, when they had to have intercepted the ILS glide slope. That site was 3,400 feet above sea level and 3.2 nautical miles from a VUR known as Manas. However, it's unclear whether this VUR station was tuned during the actual approach, since the two navigational receivers were intended to be tuned to the ILS frequency, which was distinct from the VUR. However, as I said earlier, the brief made no mention of the navigational database, which the pilot had installed into their flight management computer so they could see those same distances on their navigation display. The captain began his briefing based on the weather prediction, which showed that runway 26 would probably be in use, even though they were still too far from the airport to get the real weather. He was briefed on the foggy weather that was expected, the kind of approach they would be flying, in this instance, a fully autonomous Category 2 ILS approach followed by an Autoland, and the no-thumbs that may impact them. In addition, he discussed the vertical profile for the approach and the minimum sector elevations for terrain clearance. He did not discuss the check heights or the minimums they would use, which in this instance were set to 100 feet radio altitude. In addition to outlining the missed approach point and what to do if they had to fly the missed approach procedure, both of which are standard in any approach briefing, the captain also described the distinctions between flying a normal approach and a fully automated approach, which is what they were going to do. This covered what he would do in the event of certain malfunctions and how he would handle the autopilot system. When discussing the various failures that could occur, the captain stated that if he saw runway lights, he would call landing. If not, he would call go around. Additionally, if an emergency occurred above or below 1,000 feet, for example, if we got an autopilot, no land tree, or no land above 1,000 feet, or if we got an autopilot or no outland at all, he would execute a go around. The final report includes the cockpit conversation, which has been translated from Turkish to English, so it is not flawless. He went on, "We'll try to re-engage if the autopilot disconnects. We will circle again if it occurs below 1,000 feet above the landing zone, and we will circle again if the ILS deviation is less than 1,000 feet. That may have seemed a little sloppy, which, as I said, was most likely due to the translation, but it makes it abundantly evident that the captain intended to try to fix almost any problem once the plane had down below 1,000 feet during approach. Keep it in mind, It's perhaps also worthwhile to briefly describe the strategy that these pilots were going to take at this point. The most popular strategy we use for instrumental opponents is an ILS strategy. The glide slope and localizer, two sets of antennas on the ground, send out lobes of radio signals at two distinct frequencies, which the aircraft's sensors subsequently pick up. The instruments will then be able to determine whether the glide slope is above or below the aircraft, or if the localizer centerline is to the right or left of the aircraft, based on how those lobes interfere with one another. With a typical Category 1 ILS, this kind of approach can lead an airplane down to around 200 feet over the ground and is very precise. In order to safely guide the aircraft down to a manual landing, the pilot must have sufficient visibility of the approach and runway environment from that altitude. However, Category 2 and Category 3 ILS techniques are also available. These function roughly in the same manner, but they have a number of extra restrictions and are only used in poor visibility situations, such as fog. Increasing the distance between planes is one of them. Landing, a larger space around the antennae that must be protected, and heightened demands on the airport's backup electrical supply. Pilots nearly often use the aircraft's Autoland feature while flying Category 2 or 3 ELS approaches. This implies that the pilots will merely oversee the aircraft's performance during the actual landing, leaving the aircraft to manage it. The pilot in charge will take over at a later time. This implies that the airport, pilots, and aircraft must all be certified to conduct these kinds of approaches, and pilots are often evaluated on their proficiency every 6 months. Aircraft qualified to fly Category 2 and Category 3 approaches may do so in a fail operational or fail passive manner, which adds a crucial component to the already complex situation. The two autopilots will separately pair with the ILS and begin flying the approach down towards the runway if the aircraft's autopilot system fails passively, as it does in the Boeing 737 fleet I fly. However, the system would not be able to determine which autopilot is right and would simply disengage if one of those autopilots suddenly began informing the airplane that it should, say, make a turn, while the other autopilot did not signal the same. Additionally, a missed approach will need to be flown right away as the autopilots have been disabled. However, internal components will enable the airplane to fly the approach even if a problem is detected if it is not functioning. 3 autopilots were installed on the Boeing 747-400, enabling it to remain fail operational and continue flying the automated approach even in the event of specific malfunctions. The airplane then began to approach its intended peak of descent shortly after the captain concluded his approach briefing. After the pilots finished the descent checklist, the first officer phoned Bishkek Control to request their initial descent at 51 minutes after midnight. At first, they were allowed to descend. At that moment, the flight was about 131 miles east of Manasviur, across a region with very high mountains, reaching flight level 220, or around 22,000 feet. The aircraft was now following its pre-programmed tracking course down towards the airport after the captain started the descent utilizing the LNAV and VNAV autopilot modes. However, as I said before, there were very high mountains underneath them, so the 22,000-foot limit was put in place to keep them away from that area. The crew was summoned up by the air traffic controller as they descended to tell them of the most recent weather conditions for their location. According to the information provided, runway 26 was operating as intended, with a visual range of 400 meters at the start of the runway and 325 meters in the middle and end sections. Furthermore, it was stated that the vertical vision was 130 feet. This was not ideal, but it was generally consistent with the pilot's behavior. Already anticipating, and the landing zone's visibility was over the 350-meter minimum needed to initiate the approach. The aircraft leveled out at flight number 220 approximately 7 minutes after the fall began, and the autopilot entered altitude hold. This level off indicated that they were now getting higher and higher on profile, which is not unusual in high-terrain regions. This is because the flight management computer almost always computes using a continuous idle decline from the beginning of the descent. At this time, the pilots were flying in clear air, allowing them to see the mountains plainly through the clouds below, which they also discussed. After a little time, the controller phoned them again and gave them the same weather and visibility details as previously. The controller only instructed them to keep flight number 220 until further notice, since there were still mountains below them, despite the first officer's confirmation that he had gotten the information the first time and his request for more descent on the captain's orders. The speech recorder in the cockpit began to detect a hint of irritation from the pilot at this time. He probably didn't enjoy the fact that he was rising higher and higher on the profile as he was staring down at his navigation display. At 66 miles from the airport, he informed the first officer they would undoubtedly need further descent. That is equivalent to 3 times his height, which is the standard method by which we manually determine the number of track miles required for descent. Because the overall energy state of the aircraft is a mix of the kinetic energy, which is your speed, and the potential energy, which is altitude, you may use this approach to start reducing your speed if you find yourself in a scenario like this. In order to counteract this, you may begin to reduce your speed if you're going too high in the air. Later, when you have a greater clearance to descend, you can simply lower your nose and let the aircraft to take up the speed, which should bring you back to your profile. However, this was not done by the captain. Furthermore, he still had a lot of track miles remaining at this point, so there were plenty of additional ways he could make it better. He then instructed the first officer to request descent once again, and this time they were given the all-clear to drop to flight level 180 and stay there until they reached at least the elaborate Raxit point. The captain became even more irate that the controller was intentionally keeping them high since, according to their charge, the minimum altitude to maintain over that location for terrain clearance was flight level 170. However, in actuality, the very frigid temperatures in this location were the reason the controller had granted them an additional 1,000 feet. An airplane will actually be closer to the ground in very cold conditions than in warmer ones because cold air has a lower volume than warm air. The controller was really doing just that since this temperature requires that the minimum terrain clearance heights be adjusted. The crew promptly switched to the Bishkek approach controller when the area controller instructed them to do so when the aircraft leveled off once again. However, they were both whispering some derogatory remarks about that former controller when they were switching the frequency. So why does it matter so much that they did it? Because it indicates that the pilots, particularly the captain, were probably beginning to sense that tension was beginning to build up here. Perhaps as a result of the flight delay, they maintained above the profile, or even some onsetting tiredness. The issue with this approach is that it might result in what is known as get-there-itis, which essentially means that the pilots will be more goal-oriented than they should be and may therefore overlook crucial hints that should prompt them to make other choices. Regardless, they were authorized to descend to flight level 620 and continue to the Takba 1 arrival for the ILS approach runway 26 when the first officer checked in with the approach controller and discovered that the Raxt had already overflown. The approach chart indicated a minimum altitude of flight level 620 by Takba, which was just what they had anticipated. The skipper, however, looked annoyed by this clearance once again and growled, "They left us high again." The aircraft was now flying much higher than it should have been, but the captain had a perfect opportunity to return to that profile since he was now allowed to drop 12,000 feet without any restrictions. However, in order to get that fall rate going, he would need to act fast, increase drag by switching to speed brakes right away, and maybe even raise the speed. But none of this was his doing. Initially, he kept the speed at around 260 knots by simply selecting the level shift and lowering the thrust to idle. Additionally, he informed the first officer that he intended to use Takba to go to flight level 620. At this time, Takba was only approximately 27 nautical miles away, and they had around 12,000 feet to descend, as I previously said. According to the methodology we previously discussed, you will get track miles if you make the necessary drop 3 times. That 12 times 3 equals 36 in reality. This meant that unless something was done right now to fix it, 27 miles was far too near to accomplish what he had planned to do. We pilots must do these kinds of calculations all the time to ensure that our descent planning is under control while we are in the air. The skipper must have eventually realized this as well, since he soon began to progressively raise the speed until it reached 280 knots, which was still insufficient. At this point, the plane reached a layer of clouds that extended all the way to the ground. The pilots now had to turn on the engine and wing anti-ice, since the ambient temperature was much below freezing. Their ability to descend was further negatively impacted, since the engines had to spool up a little to provide the additional bleed required for the anti-ice systems, which caused the descent rate to drop even more. The first officer reported that the ILS frequencies were now tuned and recognized, indicating that the navigational system was now set up and prepared for the approaching approach. The captain continued to increase the speed gradually. The captain turned the autopilot to vertical speed mode and raised the speed to 2,400 feet per minute while still attempting to return to the profile without activating his speed brakes. Simultaneously, he reduced the chosen speed to 280 knots. But since the aircraft in vertical speed mode prioritizes the vertical speed, as the name implies, the speed just continued to rise to 317 knots. The speed limit below 10,000 feet is 250 knots in almost all locations, and that was also ATC to airlines' standard operating procedure. However, the captain informed the first officer that he would ignore this and continue to fly at a high speed below 10,000 feet, at least initially. It's not a huge thing to do this in controlled airspace with ATC consent, but in this instance, it was an indication that the aircraft was not in a healthy energy level, and as they began to approach, the situation became more serious. What more could they have done? There are a few different approaches to handling this situation. As I previously said, if you are far out, using the speed brakes and going fast may often assist. However, as you near the approach, you often need to do the exact opposite, which is to slow the aircraft down. Although employing the landing gear is a little excessive, doing so will temporarily raise you even higher above the profile and allow you to use flaps, and maybe lengthen the landing gear to increase the total drag. Your vertical speed may be lower if you choose to use speed brakes and flaps at a slower speed, but you will descend more quickly per nautical mile, which is exactly what you need as you approach. The only appropriate course of action is to request a holding pattern or delayed vectors, if, after doing this, you still feel that is insufficient. That may annoy you and take up a few minutes, but believe me, it's always worthwhile. Instead, these two pilots persisted, and the captain eventually began to extend his speed brakes when they reached 12,200 feet. After a minute or two, the descent mode returned to level change when 250 knots was also chosen on the MCP. As a result, the airplane began lowering its speed after all, but it also decreased its vertical speed. The approach controller then contacted them to provide the crew with a weather update. They were still permitted to begin the approach and continue down to 1,000 feet in the hopes that the RVR would improve. If not, they would obviously have to do a now. This clause meant that when the approach controller asked them if they were still happy to continue, they replied that they were. The RVR had now dropped to 300 meters in the touchdown zone, which was less than the 350 meters they needed. The conclusion of this narrative would have been very different if they had decided to stop here instead. The airplane halted the top-up point at 9,200 feet at time CIR 111 and 18 seconds. That is 3,200 feet over the captain's original intention. An out-of-the-pilot warning message was activated a few seconds later. This was caused by a brief trimming problem in one of the flight control systems, which was promptly resolved, although none of the crew ever reported it. This issue won't affect what's going to happen, but the fact that the crew didn't notice or call it out might also indicate that the pilots were becoming a little preoccupied. The crew was now approved for the ILS approach by the controller, who also instructed them to report as soon as they were established on the localizer. Additionally, he informed them that flight level 6-0 was the transition level and that they would have to fly at an altimeter setting of QNH 1023 below that. The first officer read this back, and both pilots switched the altimeters after that. With just 12.5 nautical miles remaining, roughly half the track miles you would really need, and the fact that they were still at 8,300 feet, things were beginning to get out of hand. The skipper asked for the selection of flap number 1 because the speed had now dropped down to 250 knots. As I previously indicated, he then requested flaps 5 and further decreased the speed to 240 knots, which was a perfectly logical move. They were instructed to drop to 3,400 feet, the lowest height they could go before seizing the glide slope, after he instructed the first officer to seek more descent. The captain requested the first officer to begin going over the approach checklist after choosing that new altitude on the mode control panel. The aircraft passed a guide point on the radio 90 degrees and 8 nautical miles from Mana's VOR at moment 0, 1, 13, and 28 seconds. This point was the last destination on the arrival before turning in toward the localizer, and it was intended to be passed at a minimum of 4,400 feet. At a speed of 220 knots, the plane crossed that mark at 6,500 feet, 2,100 feet over the minimum. As the captain requested that flaps 10 be chosen, the first officer who stretched over to do so added, "Speed checks flaps 10, we might end up a bit high here and we have speed as well," indicating that he was uncomfortable with the circumstances. The captain did not reply to the first officer's prompt, and the first officer stopped bringing up his concerns after that. In order to prevent buffeting, the pilot maintained the speed brakes extended above flaps 5, even though it was not advised to do so. The aircraft proceeded towards the localizer. This indicates that even though the captain was probably fully aware of the issue height, he chose not to extend the landing gear, which may have been helpful in this situation. Rather, the captain continued to keep the speed brakes extended, and the captain continued to keep the speed brakes extended, and the captain continued to keep the speed brakes extended, and the captain continued to keep the speed brakes extended. He set the autopilot to catch it by arming the localizer mode. The aircraft began turning toward the runway at 1.14 and 5 seconds, respectively, when the localizer beam was really caught. With a speed of 200 knots and a height of around 5,700 feet, they were now just 6.1 nautical miles from the touchdown, still very high. The captain chose the approach mode in response to the first officer's order for localizer capture. The issue was that the 3-degree glide slope they were really going for was now located well below them, even if this meant the autopilot would now be ready to detect the glide slope as well. It is now feasible to photograph a glide slope from above, although doing so requires extreme caution. Due to the way radio signals are sent, they often bounce off the ground in addition to traveling in the desired direction, which results in the regular creation of false glide slopes. The autopilot cannot tell the difference between a fake glide slope and the actual one, since the most popular ones are set between 6 and 9 degrees from the transmitter reaching above the true glide slope. Because of this, we typically never arm the approach mode until the altitude makes sense, and we are either recording the glide slope from below or we are within 1 dot of the glide slope from above. In any case, the plane was still far above the glide and was now roaring toward the runway. With the localizer recorded, the autopilot began guiding it laterally and changing its level, lowering it to 3,400 feet as it cleared. The captain ultimately requested that gear be chosen when they were 5.4 kilometers away from the VR. To get to the glide slope intercept point at 3.2 miles at the proper height, he now needed to drop only 2.2 miles, or about 2,000 feet. Finally, The speed brakes were retracted, flaps 20 were chosen, and the speed was lowered to 190 knots. The first officer arrived to inspect after the GPS called out 2500, indicating that the radio altimeter had begun to sense the Earth beneath them. However, despite the poor visibility protocols requiring him to react, the captain chose not to do so. This was another indication that he could be becoming overburdened with tasks. Do you recall that we previously discussed GATOS? This was a good illustration of it. The far simpler course of action would have been to just inform the controller that they were too high, level the aircraft down at the missed approach altitude, and then simply fly the missed approach. Instead, the captain was now concentrating all of his energy on bringing the aircraft down to the glide slope. The aircraft would have been in a lot better position, and they could have performed a comfortable and totally normal ILS after that. But it would have taken a few more minutes and undoubtedly been a bit of a bother. That wasn't an issue since they had an abundance of gasoline, and they were the nearby airplane. Pilot monitoring is crucial in these kinds of circumstances because it is the voice of reason and composure that calls for judgments like these to be taken. But regrettably, that did not occur. Follow the two pilots' conversation instead, since it will have disastrous results. Look, you can actually see the ground down there, probably seeing an opening in the fog below them, the skipper added. The captain said, "Instruments, I monitor the instruments, you look outside," to which the first officer agreed. The first officer's response was, "I'm monitoring the instruments as he rightfully should be." Now, I can't stress enough how crucial that conversation was. By saying this, the captain was removing the pilot monitoring from his monitoring job and forcing him to gaze out into the heavy fog. This was probably done because he wanted to gain an early indication of any runway or approach lights in sight so he could decide whether to land. In any case, the aircraft was still at 4,000 feet, which is a good 600 feet above the glide slope, meaning that the glide slope indicator showed full deflection down and probably wasn't even moving. The aircraft had now reached the distance of 3.2 miles from the VOR, where the glide slope needed to be captured in order for them to continue the approach. As previously indicated, the approach briefing had not addressed the required checkpoints, such as the final approach fix, which were intended to be vocally called out and confirmed to observe the altitude. As a result, they were now entirely missed. It's because the plane just kept descending at 3,400 feet with little to no chance of capturing that glide slope, at least not the right one. This was still not too severe or especially hazardous at this stage, except from the fact that the approach had not been flown precisely. They might have simply given up on the strategy and made another attempt if they had realized their predicament, then moved on to the next one. However, because they didn't, things would now begin to go in a very dark direction. The captain was aware that he was flying over profile, yet he began to yell and even curse at the controllers, blaming them for it nearly entirely. By emphasizing that nothing significant had really occurred here, the first officer attempted to reassure him. As the plane continued its slow descent and got closer to the runway, the pilot just murmured back, then requested that flap 25 be chosen. The approach controller then summoned the pilots to ask them to confirm that they were established, since they had neglected to indicate that they had caught the localizer. Without mentioning the glide slope, the first cop who arrived affirmed that they were because the localizer had been apprehended. The approach controller never asked the crew to confirm that they were properly established, but this affirmation led him to request that they switch to the tower controller frequency. You may be wondering why the controller didn't attempt to warn the crew or inquire about their high altitude at least once during their arrival. It turns out that the controller was responsible for ensuring that the aircraft did not drop too low and cross any minimum heights, even though he could see the aircraft's altitude on his radar displays. The pilots had total control over the fall profile that the aircraft maintained above specified minimal heights. After checking in with the tower, the first officer approved Turkish freight 6941 to land on runway 26. The crew could now lawfully continue the approach since the surface wind was quiet and the RVR was 400 meters above their minimum visibility. Naturally, the issue was that the aircraft leveled out at 3,400 feet without having captured the glide slope, although still having the glide slope equipped and prepared for capture. In order to confirm the accurate altitude without anybody voicing their opinions, they also halted the outside marker beacon. Instead, with only 0.4 nautical miles remaining to reach the VUR, the aircraft was still flying level at 3,400 feet at durations of 0.15 and 50 seconds. Here, the captain requested flaps 30, the intended landing flaps, while the first officer responded to the landing clearance. The captain probably reached out and chose it himself since the first officer didn't react right away, and while he was doing so, the glide slope markers abruptly began to move. Do you recall what I said about misleading glide slopes? Indeed, the plane was now inside range of the 9-degree fake glide slope as it had gotten near enough to the glide slope antenna. At this point, the autopilot swiftly detected it and began tilting the plane downward at a vertical speed of around 1,400 feet per minute. The pilots would have recognized the ridiculousness of this capture if they had kept an eye on their distance here. However, keep in mind that the distance from the DME was probably not even seen since the nav frequencies were delivered to the ILS. In any event, they should have seen that they were now practicing if they had glanced at the navigation screens. Swiftly gone from the runway. At this point, the design of the Boeing 747's malfunctioning operational autopilot system begins to play a significant part in the narrative. The land tree enunciation appeared around 6 seconds after the glide slope capture, indicating that all 3 autopilots were now prepared to fly the intended outer land. When the pilots saw this, the first officer yelled, "Glide slope captured." The captain replied, "Check," setting the missed approach height in the MCP at 4,400 feet. The pilots were supposed to have finished the landing checklist by now, but for some reason, they never did. The glide slope antenna adjacent to the plane was still receiving the ILS signal, but the aircraft was now overflying the runway below. However, it was varying throughout the plates, with variations far greater than 1 dot, the most deviation permitted on an ILS under typical conditions. Curiously, however, it seems that no one was even keeping an eye on this glide slope signal at this time. The captain may have just focused on the aircraft's descent performance, which was oddly near perfect, and the first officer, who had been instructed to look outside, was probably doing exactly that. This aircraft was falling smoothly down what seemed and felt to be a 3-degree glide slope. Normally, an aircraft attempting to follow a glide slope that is moving everywhere would be tossing up and down like a buck in a bronco. How, however, could it have happened? Remember how I mentioned the 747's fail operational system, which let an approach to proceed even in the event that a defect was discovered? As it happens, this technology was also designed to handle erratic glide slope signals. Therefore, the system would go back to flying a computed 3-degree inertial route based on the aircraft's inertial reference system in the event that the glide slope signal briefly vanished. After then, this route would be followed all the way down to an automated landing or until the glide slope signal was restored. Additionally, throughout, the Land 3 or Land 2 renunciations would remain on display. Naturally, however, this wouldn't occur without some kind of warning. Therefore, an autopilot warning ACAS message and 2 master caution lights came around 15 seconds after the glide slope capture, as the aircraft plummeted trough roughly 1,000 feet over the ground. The flight director bars were deleted, an amber line was added to the FMA glide slope enunciation, and an oral warning consisting of 4 consecutive beeps was heard many times thereafter. None of the pilots saw or signaled this, and the aircraft just kept descending since the autopilots maintained flying despite the now totally unguided approach. This is a little difficult to explain since the captain had warned that any cautions or variations in the glide slope below 1,000 feet should be immediately followed by a go-around. However, that is regrettable. the characteristics of the human brain. It may be rather difficult to see beyond a decision tunnel once we enter one. The skipper then pointed out the abrupt transition from Land 3 to Land 2 that occurred at intervals of 0.16 and 0.18 seconds in the armed automated landing mode. Unfortunately, the ACT Airlines protocols still permitted an outerland approach to proceed with that specific deterioration, even though this fight probably offers us a hint as to where the pilot was concentrating his attention. As the crew joyfully called out the radio heights as they passed them, the airplane proceeded to approach, now soaring above the more than 4-kilometer runway. The first officer and the aircraft both yelled 500, to which the captain replied, "Continue." The GPLS then began crying out, which was done 5 times in quick succession without the crew responding. Now, I'm having a terrible time understanding this. In the event of a poor visibility out-of-land approach below 1,000 feet, a glide slope or a warning should always result in a go-around, as it indicates that the aircraft is departing from the glide slope by more than 1.3 dots. However, based on the Land 2 indicator, which is still in front of him, the captain was experiencing some kind of very acute confirmation bias, which may have been exacerbated by gastritis and maybe onsetting tiredness. This is the only explanation for what occurred. In any event, the glide slope warning finally vanished when the plane dropped below the radio threshold of 200 feet, which was the lowest for that specific alert. Since the aircraft was in the local proximity of the airport, the system read it as being in the landing zone, and all additional GPS alarms were muted at this time as well. The aircraft had already spilled the whole runway and was now traveling towards a tiny settlement on the other side when the first officer cried out at 150 feet, as minimums were approaching. The aircraft then called out 100 after the captain once again instructed the first officer to check outside. Even though these were Category 2 minimums, it took the first officer an additional 2 seconds to call out minimums. The captain gave a negative response, circled, and then pressed the toga buttons. However, the last link in this awful chain of mistakes, the last in a long line of lost chances to restore a safe flight, turned out to be the last delay to the minimums call. The airplane proceeded to drop, reaching a height of only 58 feet, by waiting those 2 seconds while yelling out minimums. Additionally, it was very difficult to overcome all of that inertia and begin the aircraft rising again due to its almost 275-ton landing weight. The nose began to rise as the enormous engine began to spool up, but it was already too late. The aircraft landed about 930 meters beyond the landing runway 3 seconds after the toga buttons were pressed. 165 knots, after which it bounced a little. Shortly before the touchdown, the right wing collided with trees, seriously damaging it. A few seconds later, the landing gear and inboard engine crashed into a concrete barrier that was a component of the airport's perimeter wall. A second landing resulted from the incident, and just beyond the airport's boundaries, the right wing struck many buildings in the town. The aircraft's whole fuselage was yawed to the right by those strikes, and when the wings separated, it began to roll, demolishing around 30 buildings before disintegrating and catching fire. Thank you. 35 residents of the community and all 4 passengers were murdered instantly. Keep in mind that all of this took place throughout the night. Rescue workers responded as fast as they could, but their actions were limited. It was determined that the accident's primary cause was the accident crew's negligence, which was exacerbated by unfavorable meteorological conditions at the airport. As we previously mentioned, psycho-emotional variables must have played a part in the pilot's failure to react to all of the warnings they received, but it was hard to pinpoint the exact reason. Additionally, the investigation blamed Boeing because, despite the fact that the aircraft had operated as intended, the investigators believed that the total loss of glide slope signal should have prompted a clearer warning instead of a caution to get the crew out of their deliberations and, ideally, force a go-around. Thanks for hanging out. If you liked this, hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe for more awesome content. keep the good vibes going. Check out our next video right here, or dive into more with the playlist below. See you soon.